Hello everybody and welcome to Tolpuddle 2020, #Tolpuddle 2020. My name's Hannah David and I'm the chair of the Southwest TUC. So that means I have the privilege this weekend of talking to you and presenting lots of things to you. This is my first year as chair of the Southwest TUC, so it's all new. Obviously, this is our first year doing Tolpuddle online, so there's lots to learn. So please do bear with us. If we do anything wrong, then just ignore it. And if we do lots of things right, then do feel free to praise us and say how well we're doing and how clever we are. Thank you so much. So we all know that we're doing this online because things have been hard and there's hard times ahead. But together we can work to make it better, and we do make things better together. This weekend is an opportunity for all of us to, not in person, but remotely hang out, learn things, entertain ourselves, educate ourselves. And I really hope that you enjoy it. You join us for the weekend as much as you can. You encourage others to join us, and we can all come together with the spirit of Tolpuddle, even if we're not there in person. So please do stay with us. There's a team working, as there always is, smaller team than usual, but we have me here in Bristol. We've got Inez and Tanya up in North Bristol, in Southwest TUC HQ. We've got Nigel, Joe and Gary in the studio in Dorchester. We've obviously got Tolpuddle Tom at Tolpuddle Museum, and there's lots of other people around who've been working hard on this, backing us up. And I really hope you enjoy what I think is going to be a really special weekend. We're all here in the Southwest. Hopefully we're reaching you across the country and hopefully internationally. That's the great thing about us having this all broadcast online. Some of it's going to be live, a lot of it's going to be live, as I say, forgive us. But there's also going to be a lot that's recorded that you can share after the event. So please do. Please speak to us online, #Tolpuddle 2020. Check out what's going on throughout the weekend. Now's the time to sign up to all of the Zooms. Some of them, you can see afterwards and you can just join up at the time. But things like my talk tomorrow at 12 o'clock with Shami Chakrabarti, that is a Zoom exclusive, a special Zoom discussion. So please join up now so you can see that with us. You're at home, so I'm sure you know where the toilets are and the exits. I hope you've been supplied with lots of food and drink for the weekend. I've got my crew helper in the other room waiting to keep me watered. Please do keep yourself fed and watered, as always, at these things. Make sure you remove your rubbish responsibly and recycle wherever possible, the usual. So we're lucky enough to have our first video, a message of support that we'd like to share with you. So over to the first video.
Every summer we celebrate our proud labour movement's history at rural trade union festivals all around the country. The Women Chainmakers, Tolpuddle, Burston and others. We come together in lanes, fields and tents to remember the lives, struggles and victories of rural workers and communities. True solidarity through the generations. Sadly, we won't be gathering, but we won't be silent. The Chainmakers and Tolpuddle are going digital with online talks, films, speeches and music. Tolpuddle will even hold a virtual procession. All our wonderful, colourful memories will be shared online. Because as trade unionists, we always find a way to stand shoulder to shoulder, and we will continue to do so. The importance of our workers has never been more clear. Agricultural and food workers have kept food on our tables. Teachers have kept key workers' children safe and educated. Refuse workers have kept our streets clean. To you and all workers that keep us going, thank you so much. Unite will never stop fighting for your safety, your jobs and your incomes. We'll stand up to the greedy bosses using this pandemic as an excuse to slash jobs and pay. So my message to you is join with families, communities and fellow workers virtually or however way you can to celebrate our past. Stay upbeat and determined. When this crisis is over, we'll be back bigger and better like never before.
Right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Radical History of 2020. Normally, in this date in July, we meet in the village school or in a tent or a marquee. But here, because of the coronavirus, we've decided to bring the Radical History School online. And it's my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome Dr. Rose Wallis to the Radical History School 2020. Very different to last year. I know Rose was thinking last year about how she was going to manage in a tent, but you did brilliantly well, I have to say that. And that's why you got invited back this year, I think. Rose is a senior lecturer in British social history at the University of the West of England. Her research and teachings focused on criminal justice, histories and heritage. She's got a particular interest in county government and the magistracy of the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in the prosecution of social protests. She's also a consultant historian for the Shire Hall Historic Museum in Dorset, which many of us will have been to, and Associate Director of the Regional History Centre in the UWE. Thank you very much to all of you who've joined us. I think there's something like 51 now joined us. Thank you very much for joining. There is a code of conduct which I've sent out to all panelists, and you'll be able to read that. So hopefully that's okay. If you've got questions and answers, could you please put those into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be keeping an eye on that. If you'd like to chat to each other, then please feel free to chat in the chat box. I won't be keeping an eye on that with regard to questions. And we've already got some comments coming in. It's very nice to see you all there. Thank you so much for the very kind comments that people have already put up. And now I'm going to hand that. Oh, I'm going to ask Rose first. What got you interested in history in the first place, Rose?
Well, I think I've been interested in history for as long as I can remember, and I think it probably came in part from my lovely dad, who's no longer with us. But he was very interested in history, and he'd kind of raise historical perspectives or muse on what it was like to live in the past, pretty much at every given opportunity. So I think that kind of influenced me. I've always liked historic novel, well, not necessarily novels, but historic stories, and imagining what it was like to live in the past. And then I've had some amazingly influential teachers. My secondary school teacher, Lawrence Wilmshurst, who was a big unionist, he was a big influence on me.
A big shout out.
Yeah, a big shout out to him. But also my colleague Steve Poole at UWE, who will be speaking later for the festival, he's really the one who kind of encouraged and developed my interest in criminal justice histories. So there's, yeah, shout out to him as well.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to Steve's session as much as I'm looking forward to this one as well. So that's great. Thank you very much, Rose. So, Rose, I now intend to hand over to you for a little while we investigate the topic that you're going to bring to us this afternoon. I look forward to it.
Thank you. So now I've got to do the little technical bit, which involves sharing my screen, and hopefully people can see that. So the topic of my talk today is about exploring criminal lives and the online resources that we can use to do that. Now, one of the reasons why we should study crime, I think, or why I study crime and its regulation, is the extraordinary insight it gives us into past societies. What was considered criminal and how it was treated reflects the values and attitudes of the time. And obviously this changes over time as well. The other important thing about the records of criminal justice is that it offers an insight into the lived experience of ordinary people who are otherwise frequently absent from the historical record. Working people don't often leave accounts of their lives, certainly not in the 18th and 19th centuries. We don't have access to diaries, memoirs, even correspondence necessarily. When their lives are recorded, it's often where they impinge on government. So in terms of being recorded in the census perhaps, or in the records of the poor law, but also in the courts. Now, the records of criminal justice don't just allow us to see how people were treated at law, or oppressed by the courts even, but their records reveal other details, perhaps incidental to the prosecution of crime, but that help us understand what their lives were like. So hopefully this is going to work. She says, trying to change the slide. There we go. One of the first online resources I used way back as an undergraduate was this, the Old Bailey Proceedings Online, which offer really detailed transcripts of some of the trials that took place at the Old Bailey in London between 1674 and 1913. I think there's now almost 200,000 cases online. Now, as well as the scope for all sorts of studies of patterns of crime, prosecution and punishment, the proceedings reveal details of ordinary lived experience. By reading against the grain, so beyond or apart from the focus of the criminal trials, the testimonies of the thousands of witnesses, prosecutors and defendants discuss all aspects of life. In an edition of the London Journal published to mark the completion of the digital archive in 2005, it showcased its potential with articles concerning all sorts of things, but including the family lives of soldiers and sailors gleaned from the proceedings, and on homosexual culture, not just its persecution, but the social and mental world of gay men in Georgian London. In their introduction to this edition, Tim Hitchcock and Bob Shoemaker celebrated the potential for online archives to make material once disregarded and inaccessible available. An everyday resource, they called it, consulted not just by scholars, but by family and local historians, journalists, and the simply curious. Now, I think it's really owing to the interest of local and family historians that we've seen the proliferation of online archives. These are just some of the ones that I'm going to be referencing today on the slide. And these aren't just focused on London. We've got material from regional and national and international repositories now. From my point of view as a researcher, but also as a teacher, thinking about my students, online archives have become even more important with the closure of public spaces during the COVID pandemic. Now, these archives aren't without their limits, but they can offer an extraordinary window on the past. And I'm pretty sure from some of the comments I've seen, some people may already be familiar with these. So what I'm going to try and do today is talk through a sort of practical example of how we researched one of the cases for Shire Hall Courthouse Museum in Dorchester. Les has already mentioned that some of you may have been there, but if you haven't, the museum was opened in 2018, and it's there to discuss the history of English criminal justice, but also to help us think about what justice is and what the role of law is in society in the past and present. So the case I'm going to be talking about concerns the prosecution of Elijah Upjohn for the theft of a pair of trousers. He was tried in April 1834. Now, this was just a couple of weeks after the Tolpuddle Martyrs had stood in that very same dock in the courtroom. Now, aside from the local link to the festival, I chose this case because it's one that we built up from quite a broad range of often online archival material. So hopefully it'll provide an example of what we can expect to find in terms of the archives of regional courts and some of the things that we can do with that online material. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the sort of detailed evidence available to us in the Old Bailey proceedings in regional records. Often the testimonies of those involved in a trial don't survive. So we have to piece together a story from often brief details, but by considering them in context and in relation to other records, we can create a much fuller picture of past lives. So this is a piece of artwork that was commissioned for Shire Hall that depicts Elijah. Now, he was charged with the theft of a pair of trousers, as I've mentioned, that had been drying on some railings by the churchyard in Shaftesbury, also in Dorset. He'd taken them to a pawnbroker and tried to pledge them for a shilling, but the pawnbroker was suspicious, partly because the trousers did not look like they'd fit Elijah, and he was quickly found out. Now, there's very little detail of how Upjohn conducted himself during the trial. There's no evidence of what he said in his defence, and there's no comment on it in the press. What was reported on was his age. He was only 11. Hopefully you can see that in the slightly fuzzy clipping there. And this is what piqued our interest really in this case. What could his story tell us about the experience of young people in the criminal justice system? So we needed to find out more about Elijah. And our first port of call were these, the prison registers, which are held at Dorset History Centre in Dorchester, but they've also been digitised and made available via Ancestry, the genealogical website. And these registers can be a mine of information when we start to interpret the details and put them in context. So hopefully I'm going to be able to use my cursor here. So we should be able to see Elijah Upjohn and his offence, stealing trousers. But there are also some other details that are important apart from the charge. We've got his occupation listed as a labourer. Now, it's not that unusual to find a boy of 11 with a purported occupation at this point, but labour is kind of a catch-all generic term. What it signals to us is that he has no specific or skilled trade, which means he may well have been in and out of work, especially considering his age, but also the problems of under and unemployment in the 1830s. So this might give us sort of some idea about motive, perhaps. Next, we have his physical description here. He's described as being 4'10", a fair complexion, hazel eyes, and light brown hair. Now, this might not seem like a particularly significant historical detail, but I think it's quite powerful when we start to think about or imagine this 11-year-old boy facing the awesome prospect of the courtroom at Shire Hall, which is a space calculated to communicate the majesty of the law. So we get a feeling of what it might have been like for him. We also have the sentence just here. Imprisonment 3 calendar months and to be twice whipped. Now, believe it or not, the magistrates have exercised their discretion here and tailored the charge very much according to his age. They've been relatively lenient, I suppose. Now, there's no distinction made in the statutes for larceny or the punishments for it that were based around one's age. There was a recognised age of criminal responsibility. It was 7, and so below that age, you couldn't be considered responsible for your actions. Now, Elijah, unfortunately, was 11, which meant certainly if they could prove that he'd tried to deceive someone, which he had with the pawnbroker, then he was absolutely criminally culpable. The maximum sentence for charge of larceny at this point was transportation to Australia for 7 years, or up to 2 years in prison. So Elijah's sentence is very much light in compared to these maximums, and it reflects his age and his inexperience. The addition of corporal punishment was considered a particularly effective deterrent for young boys, sort of short, sharp shock to deter them from reoffending. However, what we can see here, this is a note about his conduct in prison, and he's recorded as being disorderly. So we wanted to find out a bit more about what it was like for Elijah in prison. So we consulted the Inspectors of Prisons reports, which are available through the Parliamentary Papers Archives. And these give us an insight into what Elijah's prison experience might have been like. It's the context surrounding Dorchester Jail. Now, Dorchester Jail had been rebuilt in the 1790s along new reformist principles. The new prison supported a regime of solitary confinement, religious observation, and hard labour, which was supposed to encourage reflection on one's wrongs, as well as industrious habits to rehabilitate the offender into society. However, the inspectors' reports reveal that conditions within the prison were far from ideal. The prison was overcrowded, meaning solitary confinement couldn't be maintained, excuse me, and allowing such communication between prisoners, the inspector reported, was considered an evil most sensibly felt. Young and impressionable prisoners like Elijah were exposed to all sorts of felons, and many feared older and more experienced offenders were schooling them in a life of crime. Excuse me. The living conditions were intentionally tough. The prisoners' diet was meagre, consisting primarily of bread and gruel. Hard labour entailed trudging on the treadmill, which was in operation for about 10 hours a day, and visitors and correspondence with the outside world were only permitted once every 6 months. These privations were considered useful, tending to increase the line of demarcation which ought to exist between the usages of a prison and the customs and comforts of the world outside. Whippings in the prison could consist of up to 24 lashes. Now, we don't know whether Elijah received that maximum, but we do know that he was whipped twice during his 3-month sentence. The only concession to juvenile prisoners was to be taught to read and write, but it was a competent prisoner who offered instruction in the absence of a salaried schoolmaster. Now, apparently Elijah's stint in Dorchester jail had little effect on him, because we find him in the prison registers again. In 1837, he's back in the county jail for 6 weeks at hard labour for stealing rabbits. And in 1838, he's committed again for trial for stealing shoes. It's also noted that his behaviour is persistently disorderly in each of these records. He does, however, learn to read and write. In the 1837 entry, they give it's imperfect is the listing for his education level, but by the time we get to 1838, he can read and write. We don't know how far that may have been developed through his time in the prison. Anyway, we wanted to find out more about Elijah's background to help us start to think about why he might have committed these crimes. And we had some brilliant volunteers at Dorset History Centre who raided local records and genealogical websites to construct a picture of Elijah's family. And what we found indicated that Elijah didn't have perhaps much in the way of financial security or guidance at home. We find Henry Upjohn, his father, in the prison registers as well. Henry was a gardener and formerly had been a soldier, and he fell foul of the law in 1821. He was convicted of conspiracy to commit a theft from a shop and sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. Henry faced a further month at hard labour in the county jail in November 1825 for refusing to assist his wife and family. And in 1826, he was charged with breaking and entering and was transported to Australia for 7 years. Now, Elijah was probably about 3 years old when his father left, but he didn't ever return to England, so the family was separated at that point. You might argue then that the sorts of opportunistic thefts that Elijah perpetrated were partly motivated by poverty, an attempt by a young boy without regular or permanent work or an adequate family income to make ends meet. Now, the courts were tough on repeat offenders like Elijah. No mercy was afforded for his third offence in 1838. He may have been considered incapable of reform and they needed to remove him from society. So he's transported to Australia for 7 years in 1838, and he's aged just 16 at this point. Now, the records of those who've been transported are actually really rich. We have lots of material from British and Australian records, archives that have been digitised and put online. Now, I'm sure some people, I think I noticed in the comments, some people mentioned transported ancestors. So hopefully they'll be familiar with the digital panopticon. This is a sister project connected to the Old Bailey Proceedings team, and it brings together records from a host of genealogical sites, National Archives and Australian archives. So, and it doesn't just cover people who were tried in London. This is a screenshot. I was too scared to try and do this live on the internet, of Elijah Upjohn's record. And this is the Life Archive. So it's a kind of little timeline of the records they have available. And you can use the blue hot links on the corner of each of these records to go through and see transcripts or more detailed information, and sometimes facsimiles of the original documents. So following some of the sources that are in the digital panopticon, we know that Elijah was held on the Leviathan convict hulk before setting sail for Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, from Portsmouth in March 1839, which is about 8 months after his trial. He sailed on a ship called the Marquis of Hastings. Now, the National Archives have digitised and put online the surgeon's log for this 4-month voyage, which gives us a bit of an insight into what it was like. The ship was plagued by sickness owing to cold and damp conditions, and we find Elijah being treated for rheumatism by the ship's surgeon. He fared comparatively well, actually, because 7 other convicts died on board that voyage. Libraries Tasmania have made the conduct records of people who were transported available, and the conduct records covers the kind of duration of their sentence while they were in the penal colonies in Australia. Now, this is an image of it. It's one of the worst records I've ever had to try and transcribe. I think it's written and written over as well. But I think I've pulled out enough here to be able to tell you that Elijah was engaged in both public works as part of his sentence, but also assigned to work with different masters. He was also repeatedly punished for neglect of his duty, disorderly behaviour, insolence, and going AWOL. Punishments included 24 lashes on one occasion, hard labour, and a period of solitary confinement. I think one of my sort of favourites was that he avoided prosecution. He was in fact discharged for having a quantity of confectionery improperly in his possession. So this is still the young man who kind of maybe had sweets in his pockets when he shouldn't. The digital panopticon records that Elijah was given his ticket of leave in August 1844, but we can just make out a note in the conduct record that it looks like he got a free certificate in 1845. So rather than a conditional release, he was actually released. Now, one of my favourite all-time digital resources has to be Trove. This is the Australian newspaper archive, which is freely available online. And this allows us to track Elijah down under. And again, he's really made visible by his contact with the courts and local government. So we first encounter him in 1845. He doesn't seem to have got off to a very good start. He's been apprehended in possession of counterfeit coins and stolen property, and sentenced at Hobart Sessions to 2 years imprisonment at hard labour. However, by 1852, Elijah has moved to the mainland, to Victoria. A notice in the local newspaper seeking information about his lost horse puts him in Geelong, and then he appears as a witness in defence of his brother William at the police court in 1853. Now, this last case provides some really interesting and important details. Firstly, we have the presence of his brother. Now, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to discuss this with some of the staff at Melbourne Jail Museum. And we think William emigrated to Australia. He wasn't a convict who was transported. But we also know that his father, Henry, ended up in Victoria, in Ballarat, so the same region. So there's a possibility, we've yet to sort of track this down, that they may have actually reconnected there. The proceedings against William concerned an accusation of maliciously damaging some trees. Now, the complainant, Mr. Higgins, had previously bought the plot of land, and he bought it from Elijah. So we know that Elijah was a property holder, or at least had been, in 1853, sorry. And then in 1854, and I don't know if you can see this, possibly if you can see our faces over that, but we have a notice of Elijah's marriage to a young woman called Anne Copp, originally from Exeter in Devon, at St Paul's Church, Geelong, and this is published in the Melbourne Argus. The Founders and Survivors Project, which is another sort of database, a bit like the Digital Panopticon, that looks at the lives of transported convicts, indicates that Elijah and Anne had 5 children between 1855 and 1864, sadly losing 2 in their infancy. But what we perhaps see here maybe is the beginnings of a fresh start for Elijah. And from 1859, we find him in Ballarat, which is about 50 miles northwest of Geelong and 70 miles west of Melbourne. And he's trying to cultivate a business as a nightman. Now, the population of this region, particularly Melbourne, was growing rapidly in the middle of the 19th century, and the problem of waste disposal was a serious one. There were no sewers, so waste was disposed of in cesspits or pans in outhouses, which were emptied by nightmen. So not a very glamorous occupation, but probably a very necessary one. I should point out the photograph here is not an image of Elijah, unfortunately. It's a much later image, an early 20th century one of Dunnyman Andre Gourlay from Broken Hill in New South Wales, but it kind of evoked Elijah for me anyway. The council meetings reported in the press detail Elijah applying for licenses to work as a nightman. And he shows kind of a significant degree of entrepreneurship, I think. He asked both the Eastern and Western municipal councils if they would protect him from competition. Neither of them would support a monopoly, but they did agree that they wouldn't allow unlicensed nightmen to operate on his patch. In March 1859, Elijah reports 20 to 30 properties to the town inspector as nuisances, claiming that they were in desperate need of having their pans and outhouses and cesspits emptied. So his aim was to have the business ordered to him. But the inspector and the council chairman refused. It's recorded in the newspaper that the chairman stated, "The fact of the matter is, the man wants exorbitant prices. He charges £5 or £6. But I still think it's quite interesting how Elijah is trying to create his own kind of little empire, a monopoly on the local night soil trade. His enterprises, however, were not trouble-free, and he clashed with local authorities repeatedly. He was refused a licence in 1860, and in 1863, his application for another licence is only granted on a trial basis. The Star noted it was remarked that the applicant had been fined in the police court for depositing night soil in various parts of the township, and his new licence would be revoked on the first complaint. In 1869, he was fined £5 plus costs, or to serve a month in prison for illegally disposing of 2 loads of night soil in an old quarry. Again, it was reported that Elijah intimated his intention of taking the imprisonment, so it perhaps indicates that he couldn't afford to pay this quite significant fine. In November 1870, he faced a further fine of £20 or 3 months in prison, again for depositing offensive matter on private property. And the charge received some editorial comments citing his illegal practices, on several occasions endangering the health of the population of various parts of the town. So alongside the problems of his business, Elijah also appeared before magistrates at Ballarat Police Court for being drunk and disorderly in 1864, and for destroying toys in a toy shop and abusing the landlady of a local hotel in 1867. By 1880, it appears that Elijah had hit rock bottom. In April, he was found in a chicken house, having strangled some 13 of the fowls there. In his defence, he said that he'd been under the influence of liquor and that he had been driven to the crime by want. He was sentenced to 12 months in Ballarat jail. In July 1880, the Melbourne Herald reported that Elijah had volunteered for the newly vacated position of hangman at Melbourne jail and would be transferred from Ballarat to Melbourne. Now, it wasn't necessarily unusual for this particular office to be filled from someone in the prison population. The previous executioner, Michael Gately, was periodically also an inmate at the jail. In his new capacity as both prisoner and executioner, Elijah was brought to public prominence. In November 1880, he undertook his first execution and was responsible for hanging the infamous outlaw Ned Kelly. Now, this image here is from the Australasian Sketcher in 1880. It's at the State Library of Victoria, but it's also reproduced in the Melbourne Jail Guidebook. And it's brilliant, and I'm hoping people can see it. It gives you a contemporary depiction of Elijah Upjohn, something we don't always get. He's also discussed in the press. So this is from the Kilmore Free State Press. Upjohn, the executioner, is by no means the typical hangman of current literature, and though a hardened criminal himself, old in crime and long resident in colonial jails, his worst expression of countenance is that of sulky doggedness. This was his first execution, and his objectionable duties were expeditiously performed without the least sign of faltering or nervousness. So apparently he did a good job on his first time out, as it were. His history and status made him something of a celebrity. He was interviewed by the Herald in 1882 at Pentridge Stockade, which was then a prison. He apparently described himself as paid executioner and public flagellator, sir, to Her Majesty's Government of Victoria. The reporter considered him remarkably well, in fact majestic, towering as he does above those around him. Elijah resided in the jail, but is nevertheless a free man, in receipt of a salary of 5 shillings a day, plus food and board. When asked how he liked his role, Elijah's response was both officious and critical, and hinted at the prejudicial power of authority, or at least the repercussions of going against it. "I'm a paid officer of the Queen, and a necessary one too. And there ain't a man in the country can say I'm any the wrong for faithfully doing what I'm paid for, sir, that and obey orders. I've done it afore I saw Australia, and seen many a better man nor you and I shot like a dog for refusing to do what them as called themselves gentlemen ordered them to do. Her Majesty's officers orders me to do what I'm paid for, and when I agree to do a thing and don't, then disobedience and breach of government begins, things that never pay, not in the government service." So I think he's kind of hinting at the legitimacy of his role here, and perhaps his obedience, but also there's a kind of a sense of bitterness around the ruthlessness of authority and the abuses of gentlemen and their officers. The reporter at the end of the article muses on the horror of his office and Upjohn's attachment to it, reasoning that it provided a haven of refuge from the outer world that after an existence of close upon 80 years, he now seeks to shun. Now, the reporter got Elijah's age wrong. He's not nearly 80 at this point. But there are kind of implications, I think, in what he's saying, that Elijah may have become partly institutionalized. Despite choosing to represent himself, or perhaps being represented as an obedient servant of the state, Elijah was also known for his continued drunk and abusive behaviour. In September 1882, after he was sentenced to 3 months for obscenely exposing himself in public, the editor of the Melbourne Argus complained that the hangman need not be a person who outrages society, as has been the case with Bamford, Gately and Upjohn. While he was serving this sentence, Elijah continued in his role as flagellator, whipping several prisoners at Pentridge Stockade. And as the Mount Alexander Mail noted, would on his release have money to draw. And I think it's these details that are kind of important to helping us understand Elijah in this role. His motives aren't necessarily perverse or violent. This was a job, and one that paid. It offered security in terms of habitation, and he was unlikely to face competition for it. He continued in his office until 1884. In August, it was reported that he had not properly positioned the noose at the execution of a convict called Hawthorne. Elijah had gone himself to the local paper to present his case, explaining that the head warder of the jail had fumbled the knot and roundly denied any suggestions that he was drunk or kept poor time. Nonetheless, he was suspended from his role by the Chief Secretary in October, who said when he wanted a man hanged, he wanted a man he could rely on. The impact and importance of this work for Elijah, I think, are evident when he finds himself dispossessed and living as a vagrant. From the end of 1884, it was reported in the Maitland Mercury and the Portland Guardian that he was living on handouts from the Salvation Army and sleeping rough in outhouses, in continual dread of his life and would scarcely move away from the precincts of any point of safety. In February 1885, he was arrested for vagrancy, sleeping rough behind Melbourne Jail. One of the entrances to the jail is depicted here. He said that the larrikins, who were kind of young street rowdies, to use Stephen Slate's term, frequently molested him, and that some have threatened him with bodily harm. He'd been abused in the street for several years owing to his position, and he'd been previously attacked physically the previous year in 1884. He was sentenced to a month in prison for this vagrancy at the police court, and he told the magistrate that his life was a misery. He claimed the prison governor had promised him another job when he was let go in 1884, and all he wanted was something honest to do. The magistrate said he couldn't continue to let him be a nuisance in the town, but he'd write to the governor and inquire about this job prospect that had been mentioned. We don't hear too much else about Elijah, but in July it's reported that he'd been sent to Sydney. And unfortunately, in October, he's found dead in his tent at Bourke, which is at the top of the map there on the left, which is a river port about 600 miles north from Melbourne. The press reported rumours that he was escaping those he'd flogged in Victoria and may have been poisoned, but it's perhaps also conceivable that the court had tried to find him some other opportunity whilst successfully removing this nuisance from Melbourne. So Elijah's is perhaps an extraordinary case. Not all lives are detailed in this extent, to this extent, but hopefully I've demonstrated how we can fit little pieces of evidence together to recover experiences of people through their contact with criminal justice and local government. One thing that struck me when I was looking through some of the Australian genealogical websites, looking at records regarding Elijah, was on one that his occupations were listed variously as convict, executioner, and prisoner. But he was more than that. He was a husband and a father. He was an entrepreneur when he was trying to set up as a nightman. He also had agency in resisting authority, in the way he conducted his business, in playing the system of local government where he could, and even in creating his own image as a servant of the crown. And these stories have value beyond recovering the lives of those who might otherwise be overlooked. We've used this case at Shire Hall to encourage visitors to reflect on the causes of youth offending and the impact of the criminal justice system on young people in the past, but also the present. And it's still such a debated subject. Even this week, it was reported that the Children's Commissioner has called for a complete overhaul of the youth custody system, drawing attention to the extent of violence and physical restraint used in these institutions and the lack of opportunities for education and support that have only been exacerbated under lockdown conditions. So I suppose my point is really that we can use past lives to help us think differently about our own. So we need to keep researching them. This is a list of resources that I've used in this talk today, or mentioned as well. I've also added the TUC History Online, which isn't specifically about criminal justice histories, but there's loads of amazing primary material there if you haven't already looked. And also the Our Criminal Ancestors Project. Their website has some absolutely fantastic research guides that support people looking for criminal ancestors, but also help you interpret some of those records by providing some excellent historic context. If I've got time, there's one other thing that I should probably point out. The resources listed on the right are ones that you need a paid subscription to access, which does sort of, challenge perhaps some of that democratic idea that Tim Hitchcock and Bob Shoemaker kind of were applauding with the launch of the Old Bailey proceedings, which is free to access. But we also have to remember that archives get some revenue from partnering with sites like Ancestry, and they are perpetually underfunded. And we can often get access to these websites through our own public libraries as well. What we have seen during the pandemic is a number of sites making more online material available for free. The National Archives have done this, JSTOR has done this. And I was reading an article last week, actually, that JISC, the Education and Technology not-for-profit organisation, are looking at brokering bulk purchase of collections for digitisation, working with libraries and publishers and academics, and looking at models for sustainable access. So limiting paid subscriptions for a particular period to cover costs, and then making them freely available after the expiration of that period. So there may be the possibility for longer lasting change that has been triggered by this extraordinary context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you very much indeed. That was brilliant. If you could turn off your shared screen, that'd be great. We have one question from Gemma. Gemma, who's going to be a first-year student of yours next year, you'll be pleased to know. And
hi, Gemma.
She's asking what would be the best way to start this sort of research. And she's looked at your list, and I said, well, does this list answer your question? And she said, no, she wants to know where the best place to start would be.
Well, actually, I think, well, potentially start with the Old Bailey proceedings, partly because they give a wonderful kind of really accessible background information to the operation of the court, and lots of sort of suggested readings, lots of explanation about what you can do. And the cases themselves are, as I said, freely available and really, really rich in detail, just the most extraordinary amounts of stuff. But also to have a look at the guides on Our Criminal Ancestors. And then if you've got the opportunity, dive into some of the regional archives. The Dorset call to sessions records are really full. And it's more than just the prison registers that are available on Ancestry. They've got the court order books, they've got some convict photograph albums. So you can find out all sorts of things, and maybe kind of, I don't know, try and set up a project to trace these things. I don't want it all to go metropolitan focused. I think we should be looking at the regions as well.
Issue, isn't it?
Yeah,
that is a big issue. It's very urban centric, really, and there's a lot of rural stuff that we really need to get into in a way. I hope that answers your question, Jem. If it doesn't, please come back to us. I mean, would you say that you just go onto Google and type in Old Bailey records and that's going to come up somewhere?
If you put in,
it was on your list there.
Yeah, if you put in Old Bailey online into Google, it should be the first thing that takes you there. And it's a really beautifully easy site to navigate. And like I said, just full of the most amazing kind of contextual and background information, as well as the cases themselves.
Another question from Malcolm saying, please could you expand a little on Trove? I have to say I didn't know Trove existed, so there we go.
Well, I kind of stumbled across Trove actually when I was looking at developing Elijah's case. One of the volunteers had found a family history blog that said, we think Elijah was the executioner for Ned Kelly. And I went, are you sure? And they went, yeah. And I said, right, we need primary evidence for this. You know, I want to check all the references. And I found Trove, and it's just the most amazing archive. It's, in some respects, I think it's perhaps easier to use than the British newspaper archive. People have had experience of using that. But they also give links to magazine articles. It goes right through into the 20th century. There's magazine articles, there's all sorts of other things as well. And it's part of the National Libraries Australia kind of, provision. And it's just, I mean, it's a wonderful resource. We have so many paywalls on our newspaper archives over here, which is a real shame.
I agree with you. Another question's come in from Chris Jones. I'm not sure if this is a particularly easy one to answer. Was it common for people to attempt to join their transported relatives? Certainly, with regard to the Tolpuddle Martyrs, for example, the government made an offer to send the wives out, didn't they? And George Lovelace found himself in a dreadful situation where he was waiting for a ship to come in because he didn't know whether Betsy, his wife, and children were on that ship.
Yeah.
But that was a very rare occurrence, wasn't it? I mean, I rather assume in some cases people did go off to join transported relatives. Well, it's an expensive business.
I think there's a couple of points there. I mean, I can't categorically say how often it happened. And transportation, really off the back of working with Shire Hall and working on the Tolpuddle Martyrs case and working on Elijah Upjohn's, transportation is now kind of a new particular interest of mine that's kind of, burgeoning. And I'm hoping to bore everybody to tears with it next year at the festival as well. But the point about Tolpuddle Martyrs is they were using George Lovelace's family as leverage as well. They were trying to get him to accede to different conditions by saying, we'll bring your family to you. And I think that was really that was perhaps very unusual. The thing about William, and it's something we discussed, William Upjohn, something we discussed with colleagues at Melbourne Jail, is the timing of when he goes out. In the 1850s, that's when actually kind of convict transportation's dwindling, but the gold rush is starting. So you will probably have more people going out to kind of think about making their fortune. And William shares in that, not particularly affluent background that Elijah had. So actually going out there at that point may have been a useful, and having a point of contact. There was a lot of correspondence between, but how far people could afford to do that is another matter. There were assisted migration programs in the 1830s. Some local authorities would fund people to migrate because if they were struggling to find work here, then it would take the burden off the rates. They would kind of do a one-off, we'll send you out, and then off you go. So there were programs like that as well.
Particularly with paupers. Certain parishes actually sent paupers out.
Hello, well, we're having to break away, but thanks to Rose Wallis for a fascinating session, which is still going on. You can still join the Zoom meeting to catch.
Hello, my name is Don Dolby. I'm a former NGA, GPMU, Amicus and now a retired member in Unite. A few years ago I had the honour and pleasure of helping to crew the beer tent at Tolpuddle for the Workers' Beer Company. Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival was and is a very enjoyable festival. This year, along with many events, it is having to operate digitally, so I thought I might be able to make a contribution again. I've put together a montage of photos from those years, together with some of my poems that I was able to perform on the open mic stage. The first poem, written while I was at the festival, is called Martyrs' Struggle. 6 men true stood here one day, a union strong their aim to build, protect themselves and all their guild. 6 men true were led away, hopes and dreams lay unfulfilled, frightened bosses the fear instilled, sent the men to a distant shore, thought the union was no more. But many since have known the score, that the union strong has the power still to frighten the boss and always will. For each other is all we need, to fight the might of corporate greed, and honour men who showed us how, who forsook their hoe and plough, who paid the price for comrades. Now we owe it to those gallant men, a tribute great that we can pay. The union will not go away. Another poem written around that time in response to yet another set of anti-union laws. It's called Set Our Union Free. Laws that strangle, laws that bind, laws that stifle common kind. Do we live in a democracy? Then do away with this bureaucracy. Legal ballots and an outright ban on supporting our fellow man. These laws I'm sure that you can see, so unjust for you and me. Let's just set our union free. For men and women the union cares, working people the struggle shares. A special case we do not plead, fairness and freedom is what we need. In any sense these laws are wrong, all workers need a union strong. Trade unions need an even field, to these laws we'll never yield. Let's tear down their legal shield. We cannot claim democracy if workers are not free to organise and act together, to protect and not to wonder whether their union will appear in court just for seeking our support. Working women and working men must fight for change, and maybe then we'll set our union free again. Last year we commemorated the 200th anniversary of Peterloo, another momentous event in working class history. On one of my visits to Tolpuddle, I saw a great reading of The Mask of Anarchy, the poem by Shelley. After a visit to the Peterloo exhibition in the People's History Museum in Manchester, I wrote the following poem. It is called Peterloo Revisited. Today I went to Peterloo, and I saw the echoes and the ghosts of the women and the men, and of the children too. I heard the whisper of their pain, and I saw the hopes, and I saw them dashed, and I saw it happen again and again and again. I've seen the echoes down the years, I've seen protest crushed, and progress halted, turned back, regressed, amid the blood and the sweat and the tears. Today I went to Peterloo, and I went to Tolpuddle, and I went to Saltley Gate, I went to Orgreave, and I went to Wapping too. I saw the agents of the state attacking workers again and again, in the only way they knew, with sabres and guns and rope and fear, with regressive lawmaking too. I saw the bravery and I felt their pain, when it happened again and again. But I came away with hope renewed, inspired to struggle on, prepared for battles anew, on the day I went to Peterloo. I hope you enjoyed my small contribution to the festival, and with luck I'll be there in person again one day soon. I'll finish with a short poem I wrote a few years ago. It's called A World to Win. This world may seem beyond repair to even those who really care, when war and strife and corporate greed take precedence over the need to feed. Though sometimes it seems all ripped and torn, hope is gone and dreams forlorn, it's those in power deserve our scorn. Just believe that we can break their stranglehold and somehow make a fairer world with a fairer cake. No more to let them con and thieve, their lies will never more deceive. It can be done if we believe. Come comrades now, come comrades all, come the people, heed the call. Tell them all, bring them in, we still have a world to win.
Hello Tolpuddle Online, this is Paul Scoley from Morrish Solicitors up in Leeds. We've been very proud to sponsor the festival for the last couple of years, and we're sorry that we can't see you face to face this time. We've continued to work and to support the trade union movement, unions and their members throughout the lockdown, working from home best we can, and we'll continue to do that, and we're looking forward to supporting the online event this year. We all hope that online Tolpuddle is a great success. Have a fantastic time, and we're looking forward to seeing you face to face again in 2021. Thanks.
Welcome to Tolpuddle 2020. This festival is brought to you thanks to the generosity of trades unions, the TUC and the help of many volunteers, but we don't ask or expect professional performers to work for nothing. We support the entertainment unions in their campaign to get fair pay for the work they do. So if you can, please support the festival by giving a donation, however small, through the Tolpuddle online shop.
Hello, my name is Becky and I'm from the Western Sahara Campaign UK, and I'm here to talk to you about the tomatoes you buy. Would it interest you to know that sometimes the tomatoes you buy can leave you with blood on your hands? The Moroccan government grows tomatoes in the Sahara Desert in a place called Dakhla, which is actually in occupied Western Sahara. The Moroccan government commits human rights violations there every day. When we buy those tomatoes, we fuel that occupation. It actually takes 10 times more water to grow tomatoes in the Sahara Desert as it does to grow them somewhere like Spain, for example. When we buy those tomatoes, we drain vital groundwater sources from the Sahrawis, and we finance the occupation of their land that has been going on for 45 years. You can help us do something about this. Visit our website and find out about our latest action, to write to our local supermarkets to ask them about their Moroccan tomatoes, and put pressure on UK supermarkets to stop selling these illegal products. wsahara.org.uk. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jay. I'm from the anti-sweatshop campaign No Sweat, and I'm here to give you a quick update as to what we've been up to for the past few months during lockdown. I'm sure you've seen the headlines of some of the high street brands like Primark and Topshop that have been cancelling orders on a mass scale and have been actually refusing to pay for the clothes that have already been made, which had a knock-on effect of causing destitution in the garment industry, as workers that are on a meagre wage at the best of time and certainly have no savings to fall back on or anything in the way of government support have suddenly seen their incomes completely dried up. So they're faced with a situation of not only is a deadly virus working its way through their communities, but they're also faced with the threat of starvation and homelessness as they can't afford to provide for themselves and their families anymore. And their wages haven't been paid for months, so it really is a crisis moment. So we've been campaigning around that, but also working closely with our partners in Bangladesh who've set up a food rationing program in the local community, just to provide some relief for garment workers in the local area. Our partners is an organisation called Operagio, which is a worker-owned factory in Bangladesh that make our t-shirts. And our t-shirt project was designed as an alternative to some of these sweatshop exploiting brands. So our t-shirts are made in a worker-owned factory, and the profits go to build the trade union movement inside the sweatshop industry. But the problem is a lot of trade unions generally, they have branded clothing with their union brand, but a lot of the labels of where the clothes actually come from are from the companies that have caused this devastation in these communities. So we'd like to see in a post-pandemic world, the trade union movement really think about who makes your clothes and work with us to build our t-shirt project so there is a strong alternative to these sweatshops. These companies cancel their orders and it caused absolute devastation. So it's time we cancelled our contracts with them so that we can build an alternative. So that's all we've got to say. I hope everyone's safe and well, and we look forward to seeing you all in Tolpuddle in 2021, and hopefully we can have a drink then and sing along to Billy Bragg and all the rest of it. Look forward to seeing you then. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Normally pitch up and explain what the purpose of their campaigns are at the Tolpuddle. We ask them to supply short little films, so that's what will pop up. Instead of a commercial break to sell you some soap powder, you're going to get a range of progressive organisations explaining their current campaigns.
You'll also get some Tolpuddle shopping channel stuff as well, won't you? And we should perhaps explain our t-shirts that we're wearing. There are two versions of the Tolpuddle t-shirts. I'm wearing one, Nigel's wearing the other, so pop along to our shop and you will see some of our shopping channel videos, which are hilarious, frankly.
Yes, look forward to that one. So
are we ready for the next session? So we all know that trade is a hugely important issue. It's easy to have forgotten about the impact of Brexit and possible future trade deals amid a COVID pandemic. But trade deals are going to be essential to our future. And as well as concerns about food standards, there are also huge concerns about human rights in trade deals. So it's a really important session that we're pulling up next, which will have Emily Thornberry, who's our Shadow Trade and Industry Secretary, Diogenes Orjuela, who's President of the Colombian Trade Unions, and it's going to be chaired by Rosa Crawford from the TUC. So they will be up next.
And Facebook, as well as on Zoom today. We will, for this session, have interpretation available to translate from Spanish to English and English to Spanish. In order to listen to the interpretation, please click on the green globe icon you should have at the bottom of your screen and select the language you wish to listen to. So either English or Spanish is available. I'd like to draw your attention to the TUC's Code of Conduct, which we are asking all participants of this session to follow. This is posted in the chat, which you should be able to see, both in English and Spanish. So it would be appreciated if you could read that quickly now, so we are aware of the rules that we expect participants to abide by. Okay, it looks like we have the majority of participants joining us now. So I think I might kick off. So welcome everybody to this TUC Tolpuddle online session on promoting human rights in trade deals. I am Rosa Crawford, the TUC Policy Officer for Trade, and I'll be chairing this session today. I'm really pleased to say we're joined by two fantastic panelists to discuss this important issue. We have Emily Thornberry, Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, and Diogenes Orjuela, President of the CUT Trade Union Confederation in Colombia, who is joining us from Colombia today. So you're both very welcome. For those who are joining us a little later, just to remind everybody that we are running this session according to the TUC's Code of Conduct, which you can find in the chat box. And please use the chat for posting comments, but for any questions that you want to post to the panelists today, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We will be tweeting updates from this session today, and we hope you will too. So please use the hashtag Tolpuddle2020 handle and at Tolpuddlefest for your tweets. And as I said earlier, this session is being recorded and will be posted on the TUC Tolpuddle site shortly. So the way we're going to run this session is I'll give a bit of an introduction for the TUC, and then I will hand over to Emily, and then I'll hand over to Diogenes, and then we'll have time for Q&A and discussion. So, oh, and to remind everybody that the session is available in English and Spanish. So just go to the green globe button at the bottom of your screen and click on either English or Spanish to hear the appropriate language you want to listen to. So to give a bit of background about why we wanted to hold this session today, I think it's never been clearer how important it is for trade unionists and working people to be aware of how trade deals affect their rights, pay, and conditions at work. Trade deals are legal documents, which means they can introduce laws that protect workers' rights and introduce penalties against governments that abuse those rights, just as being part of the EU treaties when we were in the EU required the UK to introduce a whole range of rights, such as paid holiday and sick pay. But as trade unionists, we also know that trade deals have the power to also do the opposite and put in place rules that increase the power of multinational companies without requirements that government ensure labour and human rights standards are respected. And whilst many trade deals do make mention of commitments to international labour organisation standards, such as the UK's trade deal with Colombia that we will be particularly focusing on today, they don't contain any mechanism to enforce these commitments, which means in practice they get ignored. So the TUC has been working with trade unions across the world, including with our comrades in the CUT in Colombia, for trade deals to require respect for workers' rights, not lower standards, or indeed put public services at risk. it's a really important priority for the TUC that we make sure the UK government secures a trade deal with the EU that puts in place those high standards of rights. And we do have an offer that the EU has put on the table for a deal that would ensure a high standard of rights, as well as the tariff-free, low-barrier trade that we need to protect millions of jobs in the UK. But we also know that the UK government continues to reject this deal and instead is going for a minimal deal with the EU and trade deals with the likes of Trump in the US. And we know what that means. The US has stated openly in its trade objectives that it wants to bring down regulations on safety standards and other worker protections as condition for a deal with the UK. We're also concerned by the other trade deals the UK government has agreed with 19 countries. These are trade deals that they had as EU trade deals before we left the EU, and they're called continuity deals. And none of these agreements contain commitments to enforce workers' rights or safety standards or protections for public services. And one of these continuity deals is the UK Andean Agreement, which involves Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. Now, as I say, the UK-Colombia agreement contains commitments on paper to enforce ILO standards, but no mechanism for enforcement. But in that way, it's basically identical to the EU's trade agreement with Colombia. The only thing trade unions have in the UK and the EU's agreement with Colombia to hold countries to account for commitments to monitoring labour standards are these civil society monitoring bodies called domestic advisory groups that they establish, which involve trade unions, employers, and other civil society groups. But the key problem with them is that they have no power to trigger investigations or a process for penalties of countries that abuse rights. It's purely voluntary whether the countries involved accept the recommendations of domestic advisory groups. And both the TUC and the CUT in Colombia have sat on the EU-Colombia domestic advisory group, use that to raise concerns when there have been gross violations of labour rights, but there is not yet action to date taken by the EU against Colombia for this. And so it's great in this session that we have Diogenes to talk about his experiences of sitting on the domestic advisory groups, where they have been useful for putting pressure on the Colombian government and pressure on the EU to take action against Colombian government, but where they still have limitations, because these are what we need to address also in the UK-Colombia trade agreement. And we know that trade agreements do not currently have adequate provisions in them to enforce labour rights because trade unions haven't been involved in the process of negotiation. And this differs starkly from the situation in other countries where there's a more developed culture of social dialogue, such as Sweden or Austria, but also in countries like the US, which is obviously not known for having a culture of social dialogue or good relation between government and trade unions conventionally. However, in the US, trade unions are also routinely consulted on the text of trade negotiations, and that has meant they've got to push for important improvements to those agreements to strengthen labour rights. So the TUC has been working with Emily and her colleagues in the Labour Party, particularly in the context of the trade bill that's currently before the UK Parliament, to push for provisions in the UK law that ensure that trade unions are involved in the process of trade negotiations so that we can make sure they have adequate provisions in them to protect workers' rights, as well as public services and other important social standards. So that's what I want to say in terms of introduction and the rationale for today's session. And with that, I'd like to hand over first to Emily to talk more about the work that she's been doing as Labour's lead on international trade and in the context of the trade bill, as well as with international colleagues to push forward on the agenda for workers' rights to be enforced in trade agreements. Just to say a few words to introduce Emily, as I say, she's the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade. Previous to this, she was Shadow Foreign Secretary and held a number of other Shadow Cabinet roles, and she is a Member of Parliament for Islington South and Finsbury and was elected in 2005. So Emily, I'm very pleased to be able to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to join you all today, comrades, and to be part of this magnificent effort to keep the Martyrs Festival alive and flourishing even when we can't be gathered together. Yes, the Shadow International Trade Secretary. I'm told that in the International Trade Department, I am regularly referred to as the shit, which I'm proud of. But it's a pleasure as well to be able to speak to you about the issue of trade and workers' rights. We know that these are dark days for the economy, not just in Britain, but all around the world. And there is one thing that we know that history has taught us, is that when the structures of a capitalist economy, the free market and global trade are under threat from recession or depression, the first thing that goes out of the window, the very first thing, and the first thing that we have to protect are the rights of working men and women all around the world. And let's be honest with ourselves, this isn't just altruism on our part, it's also about solidarity with our comrades overseas. But it's also about recognition that in tough economic times, the biggest corporations will always look to relocate production to countries where wages are lowest and workers are most vulnerable to exploitation. So the governments around the world whose response to this economic crisis is to cut wages, cut labor rights, cut regulation in an effort to lure the big corporations are not just threatening their own workers, but are threatening jobs, livelihoods, and communities here in Britain as well. So we have an immediate fight on our hands in respect of that threat, but we also in this country face a wider challenge. And to me, it seems I have a different view, which is that it's a potential opportunity when it comes to international trade. Because for 50 years, our country's trade policy have been set at a European level. And I was just thinking the other day, that we're sadly missing the voice of Dennis Skinner. And since we're missing his voice in Parliament, we don't have a single current member of the House of Commons who was sitting in Parliament the last time that the UK actually set its own trade policies. But when I've been discussing the trade bill that's currently before the House of Commons, or the trade deals that are being negotiated with the United States or Japan or the dozens of other countries around the world, the main question that I've been asking the government is simply this. Now that we finally have control of our own policy again, after 50 years, are you rising to this historic significance of this moment? Are you rising to this challenge? Are you facing it? Are you seizing the opportunity? Or are you just offering more of the same? And what's the plan? What's the vision? Because I believe it's a really big opportunity, that we have as a country. Indeed, I'd go further and call it an obligation to ensure that issues that were barely a consideration 50 years ago, last time we had our own trade policy, issues such as climate change and gender equality, human rights and workers' rights, are now at the heart of every proposed trade deal that the UK is negotiating. That's what we should be doing. And we should be engaging the other major economies as we negotiate our trade deals and be raising this and be making sure that we are updating trade policy internationally and not being afraid of facing these issues. We should be guaranteeing that this will be the case. I believe that the trade bill that's going through Parliament now, and is going to have its final reading in the House of Commons on Monday, should have contained clauses requiring the government to make the agreement and maintenance of those future trade deals conditional on the protection of both parties, of workers' rights, of human rights, and the environment. And in the time I've got today, I want to focus particularly on the opportunity when it comes to workers' rights. If just for a second you could think about the situation Britain has been in the last 4 years since the referendum. It's one of the largest and most developed economies in the world, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and of the trade union movement. Here we are, we're starting all over again with a blank sheet of paper when it comes to international trade, free to negotiate whatever agreements we choose and set the terms of our own negotiation. Isn't that an opportunity to express those values through trade deals that are important to this country? It seems to me that it was kind of one of the best opportunities we as a nation will ever have to insist that any country that wants to trade freely with Britain must respect the same rights and values. We can be a force for good internationally by doing this. And yet we have a department that seems to have no vision at all. I mean, for workers, it should mean the right to organize and form a union, the right to collective bargaining, the right to equal pay for equal work, and the right to strike. It means freedom from intimidation, dismissal, detention, and violence for union organizers and for striking workers. And it means the elimination of child labor, forced labor, and workplace discrimination. And I believe that our message to other countries should simply have been, if you don't respect and protect the rights of your workers, if you fail to abide by such fundamental principles, those that are set out by the International Labour Organization, and if you allow major corporations to exploit child labour or murder union leaders with impunity, then we're not going to do a free trade agreement with you. And the sad reality is that this Tory government has done pretty much exactly the opposite. In its desperation to agree free trade deals to fill the hole that they have created for themselves by such a bad Brexit negotiations, they've sent a message to every other country which says, we want your trade, and how you treat your workers is really none of our business. And that's why when you look at the top 10 worst countries in the world for workers' rights, according to the International Trade Union Convention, this Tory government has already signed free trade deals with 2 of them, Colombia and Guatemala, and is in active negotiations with 3 more, Algeria, Egypt, and Turkey, to secure free trade deals before the end of the year. And if you look at the full list of 40 countries identified by the ITUC, as in the bottom category for workers' rights, then you can see that the government has either reached free trade agreements or is in active negotiations with 15 of them. So there's the 5 I've already mentioned, and then there's also the likes of South Korea, Honduras, and Zimbabwe. And in the next category of 40 countries where the ITUC records systematic violation of workers' rights, there are new UK agreements in place or being negotiated with more than half of them. Dozens of the free trade agreements either negotiated over the past year or still in the process of negotiation. All of them could have been negotiated by modern, up-to-date standards. But not one of them can these Tories point to and say that there has been any sort of accomplishment, that they have achieved in any way stronger guarantees and better protections for the rights of working people as a result of those agreements. In fact, in the majority of cases, workers' rights have either not been on the negotiating table at all, or, as has already been said in the case of Colombia, they had the same weak and ineffective provisions that existed under the EU's free trade agreement. And they've simply been replicated without discussion. And it's really not good enough. It's a wasted opportunity, in my view, and it's something that a Labour government will guarantee to do differently by insisting that every free trade agreement that we sign contains meaningful clauses requiring both parties to protect workers' rights with meaningful penalties if those clauses are broken. And as long as we remain in opposition, we're going to harry the government and will continue to harry the government at every turn, demanding the inclusion of those clauses in the deals that they're negotiating. So whether it's Egypt or Algeria or Turkey, Malaysia, Mexico, Ukraine, it may be impossible to get the trade bill amended to guarantee the inclusion of workers' rights clauses in those future trade deals. But Labour must and will use the opportunity anytime these issues are under discussion to highlight the violation of workers' rights in countries with whom the government is negotiating. We're going to make sure that ministers know the name of Raoul Melal. He was the president of the Gas and Electricity Workers Union in Algeria, violently arrested during a peaceful demonstration last year, interrogated in handcuffs, strip searched, sexually harassed, and even charged with slander against the state-owned electricity company. And we're going to make sure that ministers have to face up to what's happening at the Aswan cement plant in Egypt 3 years ago this month, when employees protesting about their colleagues who had been killed while working in unsafe conditions were beaten, arrested, and forced to work. And we're going to make sure that the ministers negotiating a trade deal with Turkey are forced to confront the mounting evidence of the use of forced labour, child labour, refugee labour to fuel its booming fast fashion industry, and explain how we can be agreeing a deal with Istanbul if it continues to ignore the plight of those workers. And in opposition, in opposition, that this is all that we can do, but it's important that we do it well and that we make a big noise about it, one that's heard across the country and one that the government can't ignore. So I'm proud to be leading that work in Westminster, and I'm extremely grateful to have the support of everybody taking part today. I've just got one final thought, if you don't mind, Rosa, that I want to share with all of you, which is that in the debate that we're having in Westminster over the government's trade bill, as I said, we've been ourselves fighting for the recognition of workers' rights around the world, but we've also been fighting on other issues of vital importance for the trade union movement here in Britain, such as the rules and competition for government procurement of services and for the representation of our unions on the UK's new Trade Remedies Authority to protect our industries against unfair competition from overseas governments. But we've also been finding ourselves in a very bitter fight over the future of food and farming standards in our country and the threat that is posed to them by a free trade deal with the United States that will allow the big US agricultural corporations to import their cheap and frankly substandard production standards and their disregard for animal welfare into our country. And the fact that it's the Labour Party that's leading that fight against a Conservative government for the protection of our farming communities and the traditional way of doing things on our farms may seem strange to some people. But what the Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival reminds us, and going back even further into the history of socialism in our country to the enclosure riots and the diggers, is that we as a movement owe our origins as much to early 19th century farmhands in Dorset as to late 19th century factory workers in Lancashire. And we should therefore be proud to lead the fight against the Tory party that wants to allow Donald Trump and his friends in the agricore industry to undercut British farmers and undermine the food standards that we have in this country. So I hope that in addition to all the other messages of solidarity and resistance that come out of this festival this weekend, one of those will be with the British farming communities and British farm workers who are facing that threat. So thank you, and thank you all for inviting me to take part in this celebration.
Thank you very much for that, Emily, which was a really powerful contribution. And I think it's really important to draw the link between those food safety standards and the workers' rights conditions, because absolutely it affects workers if food is sprayed with chemicals and conditions are not safe. And I think that's important for us to make clear in the debate that sometimes becomes reduced just to the issue of chlorinated chicken. And it's really great to have the pledge from you that a Labour government would support effective enforcement of labour standards in trade agreements signed under a Labour government, and making sure that there are effective penalties in place. And that's something that's absolutely crucial to prevent and race to the bottom, as you say. And thank you for all your work to date with the union movement, holding the government to account around the trade bill, and we look forward to our continued work with you on that. And there are questions already coming in for Emily. Please continue to post questions for Emily or Diogenes on the Q&A at the bottom, and we will come to you at the end of the session. But now I'd like to hand over to Diogenes Orjuela, who is the president of the Colombian Trade Union Confederation, the CUT, which has over 546,000 members. Diogenes represents Colombia at the International Labour Organization and is also a representative of the National Peace Council. The TUC has long worked with the CUT in Colombia against violations committed against trade unionists, which continue to this day, with over 3,000 murdered in recent years. I'm sure many of you know that the TUC and many of our affiliated unions created a solidarity organization called Justice for Colombia, which has worked closely with the CUT in its activities to support the peace process. Despite the peace agreement signed in November 2016, we still see hundreds of social leaders assassinated and trade unionists targeted to this day. As I mentioned at the start, Diogenes is part of the EU-Colombia Domestic Advisory Group that monitors the extent to which the Colombian government is upholding its commitments made in the EU-Andean trade deal to uphold core international labour organisation standards. So Diogenes, it's great to be able to hand over to you now for your experiences. A note to participants that if you would to hear the interpretation, just click the green globe at the bottom and you can select English for your channel. But Diogenes, I'd like to hand over to you now, please.
Muy buenas tardes para todos ustedes. Un abrazo y un saludo muy fraternal para todos los compañeros y las compañeras de TUC, para Rosa, Emily, nuestra amiga Mariela, de acá de Colombia, que ha sido un apoyo enorme en el Reino Unido, para todos los que están conectados, nuestros amigos de Europa. Mari Cristi, un abrazo de Francia, te vi por ahí. Decirles que para nosotros ha sido supremamente importante esta relación de hace muchas décadas entre la Central Unitaria de Trabajadores de Colombia y TUC de Inglaterra, que esa relación igualmente acompañada de Justicia por Colombia ha sido muy importante, como muy importante el respaldo y la solidaridad del movimiento sindical internacional. Nunca dejaré de mencionar que sin la solidaridad y el apoyo internacional, la situación del movimiento sindical en Colombia y de los luchadores sociales en Colombia y defensores de derechos humanos sería muchísimo más difícil. La Confederación Sindical Internacional, la Confederación Europea de Sindicatos, la Confederación Sindical de las Américas, el TUAC en la OSDE, han sido todos, y las federaciones sindicales internacionales, han sido todas de un apoyo maravilloso. Y ese apoyo maravilloso en la lucha y en la denuncia por la defensa de los derechos humanos, por la denuncia de los asesinatos, por la denuncia de la impunidad en las investigaciones por más de 3.500 asesinatos desde la creación de nuestra central, han sido muy importantes en el debate que hemos librado en esa decisión de Colombia de la firma de cerca de 20 tratados o acuerdos de libre comercio, la mayoría muy desventajosos para nuestro país, que han llevado a que en este momento de la crisis y la emergencia generada por el COVID-19, la situación del país sea muchísimo más grave. En el debate del acuerdo comercial con la Unión Europea, que finalmente terminó siendo una negociación independiente entre la Unión Europea, independiente con Colombia, separada con Perú, separada con Ecuador, en esa negociación o en la ratificación de ese acuerdo, TUC jugó un papel muy importante para el debate que se dio en todo el Reino Unido alrededor de la ratificación de ese tratado. Si no me equivoco, faltan todavía aún unas pocas ratificaciones en Europa. Pero ese ha sido el debate, principalmente con los acuerdos comerciales de Estados Unidos, de Canadá, de la Unión Europea, el tema del ingreso de Colombia a la OCDE. Ha sido todo un debate por una actitud y un comportamiento muy definido en este país de no gustar o de no aceptar la posibilidad de que el país tenga buenas condiciones laborales, sea respetuoso de los derechos en general de los trabajadores, pero sobre todo ese comportamiento de considerar que el país no puede aceptar la existencia de grandes sindicatos para los servidores públicos y para los servidores de las empresas privadas. Aquí, utilizando una palabra muy de nuestro español, aquí el movimiento sindical tiene que abrirse espacio a codazos, peleando día y noche con la actitud de sectores empresariales. Hay sectores empresariales que hay que valorarles un comportamiento de aceptación del movimiento sindical. Pero la actitud de sectores empresariales que entre más poderosos son, mayor acción hacen para destruir los sindicatos, para destruir a los dirigentes sindicales. Por eso el debate en las ratificaciones de los tratados, de los acuerdos de libre comercio, siempre ha estado acompañado de este tema. Eso es lo que explica que, por ejemplo, el acuerdo comercial, el debate en el Congreso de los Estados Unidos, fue un debate de casi 6 años, en el que, como estaban al frente los republicanos, los demócratas impidieron la ratificación por estos problemas. Lamentablemente, cuando asume Barack Obama, con los republicanos y algún sector de los demócratas terminan ratificando el acuerdo, acompañado o condicionándolo a la firma de lo que se llamó un plan de acción laboral que duró 4 años, que finalmente no tuvo cumplimiento y entonces se ha ido haciendo un trabajo por las denuncias nuestras. Todo esto acompañado indiscutiblemente con el movimiento sindical norteamericano de la AFL-CIO y plataformas y organizaciones sociales que nos han acompañado siempre en esos procesos. En ese contexto, hoy lo que hay es un seguimiento de progresos por parte del Departamento de Trabajo de los Estados Unidos, con una convicción que permanecerá en todos. Es que este es un gobierno que firma y que no cumple. Pero de igual manera se da el debate en la Unión Europea, en donde también para avanzar y con la ayuda de todo el movimiento sindical europeo, ese papel tan importante que jugó TUG en el Reino Unido, el acompañamiento de parlamentarios de distintos países de Europa en el debate en el Parlamento Europeo y los debates de ratificación en cada uno de los Estados miembros, dura una buena cantidad de tiempo por los mismos asuntos. Eso es lo que motiva que en el acuerdo también se deban introducir cláusulas de protección laboral, ambiental y de los derechos humanos. Igual debate se da en Canadá, en donde en la CLC de Canadá, el Canadian Labour Congress, trabaja igualmente como movimiento sindical en ese debate y el gobierno canadiense introduce en el acuerdo cláusulas laborales por las mismas motivaciones. Este es el debate permanente en la Organización Internacional del Trabajo y fue el debate que afortunadamente pudimos tener una participación muy interesante, ayudados por el Trade Union Advisory Committee, que también duró 6 años, casi 7 años, para que se produjese el ingreso de Colombia a la Organización de Cooperación al Desarrollo Económico, OSDE. Debate brillante y importante. TUG nos acompañaron casi todos los países de Europa muy eficazmente, Estados Unidos, Canadá, Alemania, Inglaterra, nos acompañaron en el Comité de Empleo y Asuntos Sociales. Fue una experiencia riquísima, fue unos debates interesantísimos y salen de allí, en la opinión formal de ese comité, salen unas recomendaciones que son el resumen de lo que hay en todos los otros acuerdos y que son el resumen también de las recomendaciones de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo, que es eliminar las formas abusivas de contratación, es el tema de la informalidad, es el tema del desempleo, las altísimas tasas de desempleo, pero es el tema de la decisión, y voy aquí a este tema que es muy importante. Ahora Emily habla mucho de cláusulas obligatorias. Todas estas cláusulas tienen un problema, ¿cierto? es que no tienen, en el fondo, no tienen cómo sancionar al país porque no las cumpla. Mientras que en los temas comerciales siempre estar, y el país ha sido víctima inclusive de esas cláusulas en el que el país puede ser denunciado porque no cumple y ha sido amarga la experiencia. Tenemos un debate con la Unión Europea porque no ha cumplido con la importación de papas procesadas de
So there's a link in the comments to go over to Zoom where you will have it fully translated.
De tractocamiones, etcétera. Si se incumplen las cláusulas laborales, todavía no hay un solo proceso en el mundo de los cuales Colombia tenga una sanción y ha incumplido todos los compromisos en materia laboral. El mejor ejemplo lo resumo en esto. El año desde que asumió este gobierno, ha venido un gran debate de que hay que hacer una reforma laboral, plantea el gobierno y plantean los grandes gremios económicos. Nosotros hemos dicho, las únicas reformas laborales que hay que hacer en Colombia son las que ha recomendado el mundo internacional, las que ha recomendado la Unión Europea, etcétera, todo esto que les he mencionado a ustedes, ¿sí? Pero las reformas que están planteando en el país. Ahora, lo que habían venido planteando lo hemos impedido con grandes movilizaciones. Veníamos en muy grandes movilizaciones hasta cuando llega la crisis sanitaria. El confinamiento los lleva a plantear que aprovechando las facultades extraordinarias del gobierno, los gremios, el consejo gremial, que se llama así a los grandes gremios económicos, han planteado que hay que aprovechar la crisis y las facultades casi de dictador del presidente Duque, que hay que aprovechar para hacer la reforma laboral para eliminar más derechos de los trabajadores, ¿sí? Yo alguna vez en un evento en Bélgica que organizaron unos ilustres profesores, creo, no recuerdo bien si de Inglaterra o de Irlanda o de Escocia, ellos hicieron un evento donde estábamos Colombia y estaban otros dos países para hablar de que si eran más efectivas las cláusulas europeas o las cláusulas norteamericanas. Yo allí dije una cosa, estas cláusulas cumplen más un papel de adorno democrático, ¿sí? Para darle un toque democrático a esos acuerdos comerciales que cumplir de verdad una acción eficaz de obligar a estos gobiernos. Por lo que dije inicialmente, no son efectivas, no las hacen efectivas porque todos debemos entender que en general los acuerdos comerciales juegan ese papel fundamental que es facilitar la apertura de los mercados, ¿sí? A las potencias económicas frente a unas economías que son mucho más débiles, que exponencialmente tienen menos capacidad de crecimiento, pero que tienen un problema, que al aumentar las exportaciones hacia nuestros países generan un detrimento, un debilitamiento muy grave de nuestros aparatos productivos. Yo voy a dar dos cifras muy importantes. En 1990, cuando Colombia entró en la globalización neoliberal, la agricultura participaba en el Producto Interno Bruto, la agricultura participaba en un 22% de nuestro PIB de 1990. Hoy, la agricultura, después de pleno ejercicio de los acuerdos comerciales, solo participa con un 6%. Es decir, nuestra agricultura se arruinó y se acabó casi totalmente. Nuestra industria participaba en 1990 en el PIB de Colombia en un 21%. Ahora, nuestra industria solo participa escasamente con un 10% del PIB. Eso ha sido un efecto no solamente de la política arancelaria, sino que ha sido el efecto de los acuerdos comerciales, porque además, a partir del año 2012, que ya estaban en vigencia todos estos acuerdos comerciales, nuestra balanza comercial se volvió negativa. Colombia hasta el año 2010-2012 tenía una balanza positiva promedio de 2.000, 3.000 millones de dólares anuales. Entre el año 2012 hasta 2020 ha habido años en que el país ha tenido una balanza comercial negativa hasta de 15.000 millones de dólares. Hoy está en unos 6.000, 7.000 millones de dólares y nuestro país de igual manera ha caído en un problema que es de depender ya no de la producción agrícola, ya no de la producción industrial, sino a depender de la exportación de minerales. Dependemos del petróleo, dependemos del carbón, dependemos del oro y dependemos de otros pequeños commodities de materia extractiva. Eso no da el empleo. Eso ha generado entonces que Colombia, desde hace más de 10 años, tengamos uno de los más altos índices de desempleo de toda la región. Estábamos y llevamos 5 años con un crecimiento continuado del desempleo. Había llegado a índices del 12% hasta febrero de este año y llegó al 22% ya por el tema del confinamiento y de la cuarentena generada por el COVID-19. Estas situaciones llevan a que la situación de la... Ahora, pero eso ha generado, además del desempleo, ha generado unos índices de informalidad agobiantes. Colombia tiene en la informalidad, es decir, personas que no tienen empleo, que viven del día a día, que se llaman, en español se llama los cuentapropia. El gobierno ha dado en llamarlos emprendedores, pero son las personas que su ingreso depende de lo que puedan obtener cada día porque no tienen un empleo fijo. Esa informalidad es del 63% en el país. No la cuentan en los índices de desempleo porque el país los cuenta como empleados. Pero hoy, a raíz estos efectos de estos acuerdos comerciales, pues han generado todo y de globalización neoliberal, generaron una destrucción de nuestro sistema de salud, que está en unas condiciones muy difíciles para atender una extensión del...
Sorry, Diogenes, I wonder if I can ask you to just wind up your intervention. It's very, very interesting, but I just want to have time for you to answer the questions that are coming in. So is it okay to ask you to conclude?
Bueno,
Thank you.
finalizo en 2 minutos. Todo esto agravado con los asesinatos. Siguen asesinando líderes sociales, siguen asesinando líderes sindicales, sigue habiendo violación de los derechos humanos. El gobierno desconoce los acuerdos de paz firmados con las FARC. El gobierno se niega a un diálogo y negociación política con la otra guerrilla que está alzada en armas y, en definitiva, estamos ante una situación muy grave para todos los colombianos y en especial para los trabajadores. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much for that, Diogenes. And I think that shows really clearly why we need effective enforcement mechanisms in trade agreements rather than the ones that you have in the EU Colombia agreement, and which are the same as in the UK Colombia agreement. And certainly as TUC, we are working with you and our international partners to push for those changes in the EU and the UK Colombia agreement, and to make sure there are effective penalties. Sorry to have to bring you to a close, but I think it will be great to hear from the participants about the questions they want to ask from these rich contributions from you and Emily. So we do now have 15 minutes for questions.
The grapes of wrath, 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 the grapes of wrath.
As sales skyrocket, the Grapes of Wrath becomes the book of the nation. Everyone, everywhere, joins in the discussion of its vital problems. Due to this unprecedented popularity, producers vie for the motion picture rights. And finally, 20th Century Fox announces the purchase of the book and plans for its immediate production. A storm of discussion arouses the nation. Speculation and rumor are rife to the effect that no producer will venture to film this great dramatic masterpiece of human hearts. Darrell F. Zanuck, production head of 20th Century Fox Studios, emphatically announces that the Grapes of Wrath will be made. All of the resources of this vast studio are marshaled for the production. John Ford, Academy Award winner, is given the directorial assignment. The cast is carefully chosen to make John Steinbeck's unforgettable characters come to life. Tom Joad is played by Henry Fonda. Maud Joad is played by Jane Darwell. Casey is played by John Carradine. Grandpa is played by Charlie Greatwin. Rosa Sharon is played by Doris Bowden. Maud Joad is played by Russell Simpson. Al is played by O.Z. Whitehead. Muley is played by John Quaylen. Connie is played by Eddie Quillen. And now, at last, the Grapes of Wrath is ready for the screen, as the motion picture captures all the drama, suspense, action, tears and laughter of the story that stirred a nation.
General Secretary of PCS, and I want to welcome everyone to this year's Tolpuddle, a very different festival this year, of course, because of the pandemic, but let me thank those that made this event possible. Now, the coronavirus pandemic, what many of us have known all our working lives, which is the contribution that trade union members make, the length and breadth of our country, goes unappreciated, particularly by politicians and many employers, but we know the true value of it. And PCS stands in solidarity with all of our key public sector workers and frontline workers who have kept so many people safe and looked after so many of us. Particularly, we send our solidarity to our frontline health workers and those workers in our care system who have done so much and have sacrificed so much during this crisis. But I also want to say something about the PCS members that I represent, because they are often the unsung heroes and heroines of our public sector that so many people don't think about when they think about public service. I'm talking here about our workers in HMRC, for example, who've delivered the job retention scheme. 12,000 of our members in HMRC, disgracefully, are on the national minimum wage. But working from home, they have delivered a frontline key service that has managed to pay so many of our people during this crisis. And then we have our members in job centres, delivering 2.6 million claims to Universal Credit. Both of those services have one thing in common. There are tens of thousands of less people working in DWP and HMRC because of government cuts during the period of austerity. And yet now when they've been needed, they have delivered first-class services. And that is the same for other PCS members, keeping the justice sector working, keeping our prisons running, but also keeping our borders and ports secure and delivering right across our public service. And I want to pay tribute to those members. And I also want to pay tribute to our activists. You know, the lifeblood of any trade union is its activists at grassroots level. Our activists have worked tirelessly to stand up for our members in very difficult times, keeping our members safe. I'm proud to say that because of the work of our trade union activists, the majority of PCS members have been able to work from home during this pandemic. But those who've had to go into work in job centres, in prisons and ports and airports, we have ensured that we have kept them safe. And these activists are not only the lifeblood of our movement, but we are going to depend on them to face up to the challenges that we know that are coming over the rest of this year. We fear that the government is, in a rerun of what happened in the last 10 years, going to try and make those people with the least pay the biggest price to pay for the spending that the government has incurred during this crisis. And we fear a new wave of austerity, a freeze on public sector pay, cuts on jobs, cuts in our communities, and only a united trade union movement is going to be able to ensure that does not happen. So PCS looks forward to working with other trade unions to fight for fair pay. We're currently campaigning for a 10% pay rise for our members because we have lost double that amount over a decade of austerity. But if the government try to implement any pay freeze, we want to work with other trade unions to ensure that can't happen. We also want to work with others to campaign for pensions justice. We salute those unions like the Fire Brigades Union that have won important legal victories against the government's handling of public sector pensions. Now we want to work with others to ensure the government gives us what is rightfully ours and gives us first-class pensions that we deserve, and we oppose them in any cuts that they intend to make. But we also want to fight for our members who work in the private sector. Many government services are delivered now because of outsourcing by private contractors. It is only because of the efforts of our union and our activists that we force many of those private companies to pay people full rates of sick pay, rather than statutory sick pay at £19.71 a day. Now those companies will try now and reimpose statutory sick pay instead of full sick pay in many of these contracts. We're determined to stop them doing it with our Dying for Sick Pay campaign. So I want to conclude with this message. I salute our activists and our members fighting on the front line, fighting against bad employers and fighting to keep members safe. But we now want to work with others across our movement to ensure that as the pandemic is dealt with, we don't go back to the bad old ways. So we fight for a society that delivers decent rates of pay, decent terms and conditions, decent pensions in properly resourced public services. PCS wants to play our part in that. We want to work with others in our movement and other campaigners to delivering first-class public services. So have a great festival. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you get active in your union and we can all make a difference. Thanks very much.
My name's Simon Dubbins from Unite the Union, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Trade Union Freedom for Orjuela campaign. This is a special message for 2020 Tolpuddle. Unfortunately, because of the situation, none of us can be there, and that's a big tragedy for us as a campaign, because last year we were present in force and we received a full backing, and it was a privilege to be part of Tolpuddle 2019, as we've been in many previous years. Our campaign is focused on trying to win the freedom for Abdullah Öcalan, the imprisoned Kurdish leader who's now been in prison for 21 years, has been held in solitary confinement in some of the worst conditions imaginable for much of that time. We believe absolutely clearly that Öcalan's freedom is essential for the wider stability of the region, peace in the region, and for respect for dignity, human rights, women's rights, tolerance and diversity. So we'd urge you, it's really sad that we're not there this year, but we'd urge all of you, get involved with our campaign. We're holding a special event on Thursday the 16th of July online for all unions to try and galvanise support for the campaign, and we can assure you we will be back in 2021 in force to take part in Tolpuddle again next year. And thanks ever so much for all the support we've always had, and we look forward to seeing you again in person next year. Thank you.
My name is Zubin, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Social Assistance Network and the Federation of Iraqi Refugees. And we are a group of volunteering civil servants and activists, and we set up the Social Assistance Network after the massive COVID-19 crisis. And we've also decided to support the Kurdish people because the Kurdish regional government are not providing the services that they should be providing as a government of a country. They're not paying wages to the people. This means that they're going through a major struggle right now, which is why we are trying to help the Kurdish people, and we are trying to support them through many different ways. Trying to provide them with masks, respirators, gloves, anything to protect them from the spread of the COVID-19. We have involved ourselves in trying to tackle this problem. Contact us or follow our page on Facebook. Our page is Social Assistance Network on Facebook. Is socialassistancen@gmail.com. So please support us. Thank you.
Hello, over to Hannah then.
Thank you so much. I think you'll already agree we've had some great talks and some interesting conversations so far. We've got a lot on this evening, but we are planning a break. So just to remind you that the kids area has a lot going on. The next thing is 5 o'clock, there's going to be the electric music session. And then at 6 o'clock, there's going to be the campfire stories. The Radical Film Festival is going to be starting up soon. At 5:30, we've got I'm Not a Monster. And then again at 8 o'clock, we've got the Grapes of Wrath. I've not actually watched that, but I think that's really exciting to see that. I'm going to join that one later. I hope you join that too. We will be having a break until 6. So I hope you take that time to get some snacks and treats and join for the long exciting weeks ahead, because we've got a lot on. A bit more about Nigel.
So we're coming back with an interesting session from led by a Canadian musical called Tolpuddle the Musical. They're giving us a bit of a preview of what is an international collaboration between Canada, America, Australia, Belgium, UK, involving young people using the story of the Tolpuddle Martyrs in a musical, and I think you'll get a good flavour when we come back. We've got more excerpts from stalls. So take a break, refresh your Facebook if you need to make sure that you get the whole of the next session. And then later on, we're going to have the launch session. My phone's going off as well. It's Osdor calling. So yes, the next session later tonight, protest. We're having jointly with the People's Assembly a cracking lineup of women trade unionists from here and America. We think it's going to be a great start, or really an evening of discussions before some great music. So come back in an hour. See you then.